The diner was alive. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of early morning conversations, the sizzle of eggs hitting the hot grill. Just another busy day. But for Harper, something felt off. She couldn't place it at first. Maybe it was the weight of exhaustion pressing against her shoulders, the dull ache in her feet from hours of running back and forth. Or maybe it was something else. As she weaved through the maze of occupied tables, balancing a tray of steaming pancakes, her eyes flickered toward the window. And that's when she saw him. A tiny, golden retriever puppy, sitting near the curb, alone, his fur matted with dirt, his ribs faintly visible beneath his coat, and his eyes, God, those eyes, huge, round, pleading, scanning the crowd, watching as people walked past, without a second glance. He wasn't barking, wasn't whining, just waiting. Harper's steps faltered. Her fingers tightened around the tray. The puppy sniffed the air as another plate of food passed by, his small frame trembling. A soft whimper escaped his lips. No one stopped. No one cared. The warmth of the diner suddenly felt suffocating. Harper swallowed, her throat tightening. She had seen stray dogs before. This wasn't uncommon. But this one felt different. A lump formed in her throat as she turned toward the kitchen, heart pounding against her ribs. She couldn't just walk away. She wouldn't. But then, "Harper!" The sharp voice snapped her back to reality. Mr. Connor, her boss, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp as daggers. She hesitated. She knew what he would say, but still, she had to ask. "Hey, do you think I could—" "No." Cold, dismissive, immediate. Harper flinched. "Don't even think about it," Connor added, barely looking up. "We're not feeding strays." Her stomach twisted. Outside, the puppy shivered against the autumn air, his gaze still locked on the plates of food being carried inside. Her heart hammered in her chest. The diner threw away food every single day. What harm could one meal do? Harper glanced at the counter, at the plate of scrambled eggs and bacon left untouched by a customer. A choice formed in her mind. A choice she knew she'd regret if she didn't take it. And in that moment, without thinking twice, she grabbed the plate. The plate felt heavy in Harper's hands, not because of its weight, but because of what she was about to do. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She knew the rules, knew what Mr. Connor had just said. But outside, that puppy was starving. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the plate as she wrapped the food in a napkin. She added a small cup of water, careful not to spill. Then, without a second thought, she turned toward the door. The cool morning air hit her skin as she stepped outside. The sounds of the diner faded, drowned out by the rapid thumping of her own heartbeat. The puppy flinched at the sudden movement. But he didn't run. Harper crouched down, slow, gentle. "Hey, little guy," she whispered, her voice soft, soothing. "Are you hungry?" The puppy tilted his head, hesitant, wary. Harper carefully unwrapped the food and placed it in front of him. A long pause, a slow sniff, and then devoured. Harper watched, her chest tightening as he ate like he hadn't seen food in days. He scarfed it down so fast, she worried he might choke. She reached out, hesitant at first. Then, softly, she stroked his head. His fur was rough, unkempt, but beneath it, he was just a baby. "You're not alone anymore," she murmured. And then, the moment shattered. "Harper!" Her name cracked through the air like a whip. She flinched. Her stomach dropped. Slowly, she turned. Mr. Connor, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, his face twisted with rage. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped, marching toward her. Harper opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. Inside, customers were peering through the windows, watching, whispering. Mr. Connor's face darkened. "I told you," he seethed, his voice sharp as glass. "We don't feed strays." Harper swallowed the lump in her throat. "It was just leftovers," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We throw food away every day." "I don't care." The finality in his voice sent a chill down her spine. Her hands curled into fists. She wanted to fight back, wanted to scream that it wasn't fair. But then, the words hit her like a punch to the gut. "You're fired." Harper's breath caught in her throat. The words rang in her ears like a gunshot. Fired. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen. The air felt too thick, too heavy. Her hands trembled as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Mr. Connor's face, red with fury. His eyes, sharp, cold. "You can collect your things and go." The finality in his voice sent a wave of humiliation crashing over her. Inside the diner, customers whispered behind their hands, staring, judging. Harper's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, wanted to tell them all how ridiculous this was. They threw away piles of food every day, every single day. But a starving puppy? That was too much? That was unacceptable? She swallowed hard, her throat burning. Slowly, she turned back to the little dog. He was watching her, his big, sad eyes filled with confusion. And something else, something Harper recognized instantly. Loss. She sucked in a shaky breath and knelt beside him. Her fingers reached out, brushing gently against his fur. Her voice wobbled. "It's okay, buddy," she whispered, barely holding back the tears. "It's not your fault." The puppy pressed his small, frail body against her side. And Harper felt it then, that tiny weight, the soft warmth of him leaning into her, as if he knew, as if he was comforting her. She squeezed her eyes shut. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She had no job, no security. Rent was due. Bills were piling up. But as she felt the little dog nuzzle into her side, as his tiny tongue flicked out, licking her trembling fingers, something inside her shifted. A quiet, unbreakable resolve. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. This wasn't the end. She wiped her tears, took a deep breath, and whispered to the little dog, "We'll figure this out. Together." The weight of the moment still clung to Harper like a thick fog. The sting of humiliation, the fear of an uncertain future, the quiet presence of the little dog pressing against her. And then, the deep hum of an approaching engine. Harper lifted her head, wiping her damp cheeks as a sleek, black SUV pulled up in front of the diner. It was pristine, expensive, out of place. The door clicked open. A man stepped out, tall, poised, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth and power. But his face, it wasn't harsh or intimidating. It was calm, steady. Yet, there was something unreadable in his expression. His eyes scanned the street before locking onto her. And then, he spoke. "Are you the one who fed this dog?" His voice was smooth, measured. A simple question. But it sent a jolt through Harper's chest. She swallowed, suddenly aware of the pounding in her ears. Was she in trouble? Was he angry? Was this about to get even worse? Her fingers curled into the puppy's fur. She took a breath. "Yes." Her voice was quiet, but firm. The man studied her. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. And then, much to her confusion, he smiled. "I've been looking for this dog," he said, crouching down. The puppy tilted his head. Something about this man seemed familiar to him. Harper blinked. "Looking for him?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded. "Yes, this little one belongs to someone very important." Harper's breath hitched. Not a stray, not abandoned. The puppy had a home, a family. A little whimper escaped from the dog's throat as the man extended his hand. Harper watched in shock as, slowly, the puppy stepped forward, sniffed, and then nuzzled into the man's palm. The stranger's lips parted in quiet relief, and then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek, embossed business card, held it out to Harper. "Come by this address tomorrow morning," he said. His gaze was steady. "I think I have an opportunity you'll be interested in." Harper stood frozen at the entrance. Her fingers gripped the business card so tightly, it crumpled in her palm. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with questions, doubts, fears. And now, she was here. The Evergreen Animal Rescue Foundation. The building towered over her, sleek and modern, its glass doors reflecting the morning sun. Inside, beyond those doors, was a world she had never imagined stepping into. Was she ready? Would she even belong here? A deep breath, a shaky step forward. As soon as she pushed open the doors, the sounds hit her. Whines, barks, soft murmurs of voices soothing trembling creatures. Her chest tightened. Everywhere she looked, dogs in need. Some wagging their tails, hopefully, pressing against the gates of their kennels. Others, curled up in corners, too weak, too scared, too broken to move. Her heart clenched, the weight of it all, the sheer scale of suffering. Could she really make a difference here? What if she failed? What if she wasn't enough? "Harper!" She turned sharply, blinking back the emotions flooding her chest. The man from yesterday, Andrew Dawson, walking toward her, a warm smile on his face. "You came." His eyes scanned her face, like he could see the storm inside her. She forced a nod. "Yeah, I wasn't sure I would." Andrew chuckled, gesturing for her to follow. "Come on, let me show you around." With hesitant steps, she moved beside him, taking in the vastness of the rescue center. Rooms lined with crates, filled with dogs who had known nothing but pain. A rehabilitation wing, where a team of experts worked tirelessly to mend not just broken bodies, but broken spirits. Harper swallowed hard, feeling the lump form in her throat. And then, her eyes landed on him, in the farthest kennel, away from the others. A small, wiry terrier mix sat hunched in the corner. His fur, patchy. His eyes, dull, lifeless. Unlike the others, he didn't move when she stepped closer, didn't lift his head, didn't even flinch when Andrew unlatched the kennel door. "That's Tucker," Andrew murmured. Harper crouched. Her hands trembled as she reached out, ever so slowly. His ribs jutted out. His ears drooped. And those eyes, those deep, haunted eyes, she had seen them before, on Scout, on herself. A being so lost, so wounded, so full of silent aching. It felt like the world had simply forgotten him. A thick wave of emotion crashed over her. She wasn't just here to work. She was here to heal. Not just the dogs, not just Tucker, but herself. Harper's phone buzzed. A single message. "You should have walked away." Her breath hitched. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the screen. The words sent a chill through her spine. Grady. It had to be him. A warning. A threat. Her heart pounded as she stepped out of bed, trying to shake off the unease. But deep down, she knew something was coming. And then, it happened. The next morning, Harper pulled into the shelter's parking lot, and her stomach dropped. Her hands flew to her mouth. The windows shattered. Graffiti sprawled across the walls. Thick, jagged letters. "Get out. Leave now." Trash cans were overturned, their contents scattered across the entrance. Inside the kennels, fear. Dogs whimpered. Some huddled in corners, trembling. Tucker pressed against her leg, his low growl vibrating through her bones, sensing the tension. Harper's chest ached, not just from anger, not just from fear, but from rage. She clenched her fists. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a message, a warning. Grady wanted to scare her, to make her stop, to make her quit. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She turned to Andrew, her voice shaking but firm. "We're not backing down." Andrew nodded, his jaw tight. "No, we're not." And just like that, the fight began. She called every volunteer, every friend, every person who had ever set foot in that shelter. Within hours, people arrived in droves. They scrubbed the walls, replaced the windows, cleaned the mess, and with each stroke of paint, with each piece of glass swept away, they erased Grady's fear. They reclaimed their home. And then, the world noticed. A local news crew arrived, cameras rolling, reporters asking questions. Harper stood before the microphone, her voice steady, her gaze fierce. This isn't just about vandalism. This is about justice, about standing up for the voiceless, and we will not be intimidated. The broadcast aired that night, and across the town, across the country, people listened. And Grady, his time was running out. The night was thick with silence. Harper gripped the flashlight in one hand. Her breath came in short, controlled bursts. Beside her, Andrew clutched his phone. Ready. The second they had proof, he'd call the police. This was it. They were going to end this. Tucker padded ahead. His small frame moved like a shadow in the moonlight. His nose twitched, ears alert. He knew something was ahead. And then Harper saw it. A chain-link fence, rusted, bent in places. Beyond it, darkness. Then the smell hit her. Rot, filth, decay, and then the sound. A faint, weak whimper. Her stomach clenched. She clicked on the flashlight, swept it across the area, and what she saw ripped her apart. Dogs, dozens of them, caged, trapped, starving. Their ribs jutted out, their fur matted with dirt and blood. Some didn't even lift their heads. One small pup, barely more than bones, met her gaze, eyes hollow, defeated. Harper's breath shook. "This is worse than we thought," Andrew whispered. Harper swallowed the sob, threatening to break free. No time for that. They had to get them out. She reached for the gate. A loud crash. Metal slammed. A voice, deep, rough, filled with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Harper spun around. And there he was, Grady. A crowbar glinted in his hand, his face twisted with fury. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" He stepped closer. Harper's pulse pounded. Andrew edged forward. "We've already called the police," he bluffed. "They'll be here any second." Grady laughed, a sick, cold laugh. "You think that scares me?" He lifted the crowbar and swung. Harper jumped back, heart slamming against her ribs. Andrew stepped in front of her, arms up, trying to block the attack. And then, a blur of fur, a snarl. Tucker. The tiny terrier launched himself at Grady, teeth bared, a fierce growl. He clamped onto Grady's wrist. The crowbar clattered to the ground. "Ah, you little..." Grady shook his arm, trying to pry the dog off, but Tucker held on. Harper seized the moment. She grabbed the crowbar, her hands shaking. Then, the sound of sirens, flashing red and blue lights. Police cars screeched to a stop. "Drop your weapon!" Grady froze. Tucker let go, landed lightly on his feet, his tail still stiff. his stance still ready. Officers swarmed. Grady's face twisted. He knew it was over. He lunged, but the officers tackled him, pinned him. Handcuffs snapped into place. Harper gasped. Finally, able to breathe, she dropped the crowbar, her hands trembling. Andrew reached out, gripped her shoulder. "We did it," he whispered. Harper turned, scanned the cages, the dogs inside. Some still lay still, too weak, too broken. But others, they lifted their heads. Their eyes held something new. Hope. Harper dropped to her knees. Tucker trotted over, wagging his tail. She pulled him into her arms, pressed her face into his fur. "You saved us, buddy," she whispered. His tiny tail thumped. They weren't just rescuing dogs tonight. They were ending a monster. The sun rose over the shelter, bathing everything in warm, golden light. The chaos of the past few days felt like a distant storm that had finally passed, and in its wake, hope. Harper stood in the middle of the shelter's yard, watching. The once broken dogs ran free, their tails wagging, their eyes bright. They were safe, every single one of them, one by one. Families arrived, tears, laughter, the purest kind of joy. A little girl knelt beside a golden retriever. She wrapped her arms around him as he licked her face. "Mommy, can we take him home?" A woman, eyes filled with emotion, picked up a trembling pup, pressed him against her chest. "You're going to be loved forever," she whispered. Harper's heart swelled. She watched as every single dog found a home. She had dreamed of this moment. But now, standing in the middle of it, she realized something. This wasn't just a moment. This was her purpose. A soft breeze rustled through the trees as Andrew walked up beside her, his hands in his pockets. He exhaled, a smile tugging at his lips. "You did it, Harper." Harper shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. "No, we did it." Just then, a voice called out from across the yard. "Miss Harper!" She turned, surprised. A well-dressed woman approached, followed by a news crew. Harper's brows furrowed. "What's going on?" The woman smiled warmly. "The world heard your story. People everywhere, across the country, want to help. Donations are pouring in. Enough to expand the shelter. Enough to help even more animals." Harper's breath hitched. National support. The shelter would never struggle again. Grady's cruelty erased from this town forever. Harper swallowed the lump in her throat as she looked around. The barking, the laughter, the happy tears. And then, Tucker, her scrappy little terrier, sitting patiently, watching her with those wise, loyal eyes. Harper knelt beside him, ran a hand through his fur. "We did it, boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. Tucker leaned into her, wagging his tail. For the first time in her life, Harper knew she had found where she truly belonged. As the camera panned across the shelter, over the rescued dogs, the loving families, the volunteers wiping tears from their eyes, one final message appeared on screen. Every act of kindness can change a life. And as the sun set on a new beginning, Harper smiled, because this was only the start.